Welcome to Brazil, the heart of South America, a land of dazzling contrasts. From the golden beaches of Copacabana to the deep green lungs of the Amazon rainforest, Brazil is not just a country, it's a continent within a country. It's the world's fifth largest nation, stretching across nearly half of South America, bordered by every country on the continent except Chile and Ecuador. Here, nature reigns supreme. Waterfalls roar, jungles breathe, and rivers the size of oceans carve through endless wilderness. Long before Europeans arrived, Brazil was home to hundreds of indigenous tribes, each with their own languages, beliefs, and ways of life. Then, in 1500, Portuguese explorer Pedro Álvares Cabral landed on Brazil's eastern shore, claiming the land for Portugal. What began as exploration quickly turned into colonization. The Portuguese established sugar plantations, importing enslaved Africans to work them, shaping Brazil's future population and culture forever. For the next 3 centuries, Brazil became one of the wealthiest colonies in the world, exporting sugar, gold, and coffee. But that wealth came at a terrible cost. Millions of enslaved Africans were brought across the Atlantic, creating the foundation of Brazil's diverse population today. The mix of indigenous, African, and European cultures produced something unique, a society bursting with color, rhythm, and resilience. In 1822, Brazil declared its independence from Portugal, led by Dom Pedro I, who became the country's first emperor. Unlike many revolutions in Latin America, Brazil's independence was relatively peaceful. For most of the 19th century, the empire expanded westward, abolished slavery in 1888, and transitioned into a republic the very next year. But the scars of slavery and inequality would linger for generations. The early 1900s were a time of modernization. Coffee fueled the economy, while new cities like Sao Paulo grew into industrial powerhouses. However, Brazil also faced dictatorships, corruption, and poverty. In the 1930s, Getúlio Vargas rose to power, shaping the modern Brazilian state. By mid-century, the dream of a new capital, Brasilia, symbolized hope for progress. Built from scratch in the middle of the country, it became a symbol of Brazil's ambition to rise. If there's one word that defines Brazil, it's vibrancy. Music pulses through its veins, from samba and bossa nova to modern funk and forró. Every February, millions flood the streets for Carnival, a celebration of rhythm, dance, and freedom, rooted deeply in Afro-Brazilian traditions. Football, or soccer, is more than a sport here. It's a national religion. Legends like Pelé, Zico, Ronaldinho, and Neymar are worshipped like heroes. Brazil is home to the Amazon rainforest, the largest on Earth. It's a world of staggering biodiversity. Millions of species of plants, animals, and insects, many still undiscovered. But the Amazon faces grave threats. Deforestation, illegal logging, and fires endanger its fragile ecosystem. This isn't just Brazil's problem. It's a global crisis because the Amazon regulates much of the world's climate. Brazil today is an urban nation. São Paulo stands as a mega metropolis of over 20 million people, the financial heart of Latin America. Rio de Janeiro, with its mountains and beaches, remains a symbol of beauty and contradiction, luxury beside poverty. Brasilia, with its futuristic architecture, reflects Brazil's vision for the future. But challenges persist. Inequality, political scandals, and urban violence remain deep wounds. Brazil's greatest strength lies in its people. They come from African, indigenous, European, Middle Eastern, and Asian roots, yet call themselves one nation. This diversity shapes its food, from feijoada to acarajé, its music, its art, and its festivals. The Brazilian spirit is known as alegria, joy in the face of hardship, laughter amid struggle, dance despite despair. Brazil is the largest economy in Latin America, rich in minerals, agriculture, and energy. It exports soybeans, iron ore, coffee, and beef to the world. Yet it struggles to balance economic growth with environmental protection. As part of the BRICS group, alongside China, India, Russia, and South Africa, Brazil plays a major role in shaping the global South. Modern Brazilian politics are complex. Democracy returned in the 1980s after decades of military dictatorship, but corruption scandals and inequality have shaken public trust. Recent leaders like Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva and Jair Bolsonaro have represented different visions for Brazil. One focused on social programs, the other on conservative nationalism. The nation continues to seek balance between development, justice, and sustainability. As the 21st century unfolds, Brazil stands at a crossroads. Its young population, cultural influence, and vast natural wealth give it enormous potential. If it can overcome corruption, protect the Amazon, and uplift its poorest citizens, Brazil could become one of the world's true global powers. Because beyond its problems, Brazil remains what it has always been, a land of hope, music, and magic, where every sunrise carries the rhythm of samba and the heartbeat of the Amazon. This is Brazil, where nature meets humanity, and every story begins with rhythm.
The rain was soft that morning, whispering over the green fields of northern France. The mist drifted between the low hills, and the world felt half awake, as though history itself had not yet decided what kind of day it wished to become. In the quiet, banners hung heavy with dew, red lions of England, golden lilies of France, two emblems that would face each other for a century. It was the year 1337. The air carried unease, the kind that settles before a storm. In London, the bells of Westminster rang over crowded streets. Across the Channel, in Paris, merchants spoke of rumors and kings. And in both lands, men whispered that peace could not last. The story of the 100 Years' War does not begin with swords. It begins with blood, royal blood, and the dangerous dreams of those who believed crowns could be inherited like promises. Edward III of England was young, proud, and restless. His mother, Isabella, had been born a princess of France, and through her veins flowed the blood of the Capetian line. When the French king died without a son, Edward looked across the water and saw destiny waiting. He claimed the throne of France as his own. But in Paris, another man already wore the crown, Philip of Valois, called Philip VI, a cousin of the dead king, chosen by the French nobles because he was a man, not a woman's child. The lawyers said the crown of France could never pass through a woman's line. The priests nodded. The nobles agreed, and Edward's claim was set aside. But pride is not easily set aside. Edward brooded in his halls, his banners folded but not forgotten. He told his barons that France had stolen what was rightfully his. The lords murmured, the ships were readied, and the forges of England began to glow through the night. Steel, wood, rope, pitch, all prepared for a crossing that would change the face of Europe. The drums of war began to beat. They rolled through the harbors, over the meadows, into the dreams of men who had never seen a battlefield. Farmers became archers, carpenters became soldiers. Boys left behind mothers who wept in silence as the sails were raised. No one imagined the war would last 100 years. They thought it would be swift, A single campaign, perhaps, a season of glory, but history had other plans. When Edward's ships set out, the wind favored them. The Channel, restless and gray, bore them toward Normandy. The English landed, burned, plundered, marched. The French gathered to resist, and soon, on the rolling fields near a village called Crécy, the two armies met. The French knights came proud and shining, armor gleaming beneath the sun. They had the greater numbers. They had tradition, honor, the flower of chivalry. The English had rain-soaked boots, rough wool cloaks, and long bows cut from yew. When the trumpets sounded, the French charged. The ground trembled beneath the weight of horses, banners snapped in the wind, and the air filled with the roar of courage. Then came the sound that would define a generation, the deep twang of the English longbow. Arrows rose like a black cloud. They fell in sheets of iron rain. Men and horses alike stumbled, pierced and broken. The charge faltered, tried again, fell once more. And when evening came, the field of Crécy belonged to England. Among the victors rode a prince, Edward's son, the boy who would be called the Black Prince. He was young, fierce, and silent. His armor, dark as night, caught the last red of the dying sun. He learned that day what power felt like and what it cost. Years passed. Castles changed hands. The English gained Calais, a prize that would remain theirs for centuries. The war paused, then began again, like a fever that could not break. And in the midst of war came a new terror, one that cared nothing for banners or kings. The plague, the Black Death. It arrived quietly, a whisper in the ports, a sickness in the breath. Within months, whole villages vanished. In London, the bells tolled day and night. In Paris, carts carried the dead through streets too narrow for mourning. Armies melted away, not defeated by swords, but by an enemy they could not see. For a while, even kings bowed before death, but when the plague loosened its grip, the old quarrels returned, as though humanity had learned nothing at all. Edward III grew old. His son, the Black Prince, sickened and died before him. The crown passed to a child, Richard II, and with him England's power began to waver. France found new strength in a young king, Charles V, who reclaimed city after city. The balance of war shifted again. Decades blurred into decades. Men were born beneath the shadow of war and died before it lifted. The world changed. Armor grew heavier. Cannons began to roar where archers once stood. And the age of knights began to fade. And then, when hope seemed thin as smoke, a voice rose from the fields of France. The voice of a girl, Joan of Arc. She was a peasant from Domremy, a child of farmers, with no learning, no sword, no rank. Yet she said the saints spoke to her, that God himself had called her to drive the English out of France. The lords laughed, but the soldiers listened. They saw in her eyes something fierce and bright, faith made flesh. With her came a miracle of courage. The siege of Orleans was broken. The French banners rose once more. And behind them, barefoot in armor too heavy for her small frame, rode the girl who believed heaven was watching. But war is cruel to miracles. Captured, betrayed, handed over to her enemies, Joan was tried in a cold stone hall by men who feared her more than they hated her. She was called heretic, witch, liar, and in the year 1431 they burned her in the marketplace of Rouen. The fire crackled. The smoke rose, and as her ashes drifted into the gray sky, a nation began to wake. The war that had begun with the pride of kings was ending with the faith of a girl. By 1453, the English had lost nearly all their lands in France. Only Calais remained. The two crowns were exhausted. The world had changed. France was no longer a patchwork of baronies, but a nation reborn. England, weary and divided, would soon fall into its own civil wars, the Wars of the Roses. 100 years of blood, and yet no true victory, only lessons written in the language of suffering. Today, when the wind moves through the grass at Crécy or along the quiet banks of the Loire, it carries the echo of that long war, the murmur of archers, the distant clang of steel, the prayer of a girl who dared to speak to angels. The war that lasted 100 years, a war that began with a claim and ended with a question. What is a crown worth when the cost is a century? And so the story fades softly into the silence of time. The night after Crécy was quiet. No songs, no laughter, only the low sound of horses breathing, the rustle of banners heavy with dew, and the soft rain that washed the blood from the fields. The English soldiers sat by dying fires, staring into the mist. Some prayed, some slept with their swords beside them. All of them wondered if victory was worth what it cost. King Edward rode among the tents, silent. He looked upon his men, archers from Yorkshire, mercenaries from Flanders, knights who still bore the mud of battle on their armor. He said little, but in his heart he felt something stir, pride perhaps, or the faint chill of destiny. The next morning, the ravens came. Thousands of them. The sky turned black above the fallen. And in the years to come, the villagers around Crécy would say that the crows still returned every August, as if waiting for another war. After Crécy came Calais, a city by the sea, strong and stubborn, ringed by walls and salt marsh. Edward laid siege to it for nearly a year. His men starved, so did the people inside. The siege became a slow cruelty, days blending into months, hunger becoming habit. When Calais finally fell, Edward showed mercy, though only just. The story tells that 6 citizens came to him, barefoot and in chains, carrying the keys of the city. He ordered them to be executed, to make an example. But Queen Philippa, his wife, knelt before him and begged for their lives, and Edward, moved by her tears, spared them. It was a small mercy in a century of iron, but it was remembered. The war paused. Treaties were signed, oaths made and broken again. England grew rich on trade and ransoms. France, poor and weary, waited for a chance to rise. Then death came not by sword, but by shadow. The Black Death swept across Europe. In ports and castles, in cottages and cathedrals, it struck without warning. Men coughed, bled, and were gone within days. The air itself seemed cursed. In some towns, half the people died. In others, all of them. Even the bells stopped ringing. There were not enough hands left to pull the ropes. Armies scattered. Fields went untilled. For a brief and terrible moment, the war ceased, not because men wanted peace, but because there was no one left to fight. When the plague had passed, Europe was smaller, quieter, haunted. And yet, somehow, the kings still dreamed of crowns. In England, the Black Prince grew to manhood. He was his father's son, noble, fearless, and certain that destiny favored him. In France, he would carve his legend at Poitiers, another field, another sea of iron and cries. There the English were outnumbered once more. There the longbow sang again. And when it was over, the King of France, John II, was taken prisoner. A king captured by a prince. The English brought him to London, and he lived there in comfort, treated as an honored guest rather than a captive. But the ransom demanded was enormous, so vast that France groaned under its weight. Taxes rose, fields emptied, bandits roamed. The people began to wonder if kings were worth the suffering they brought. In those years, the war became less a story of heroes and more a pattern of ruin. Armies burned the land simply to deny it to their enemies. Villages vanished. Children were born never knowing a world without war. The chivalry that had once guided knights, honor, loyalty, the sacred rules of combat, began to rot. Mercenaries fought for gold, not glory. Nobles switched sides when it suited them. And beneath the splendor of banners and armor, Europe was slowly bleeding out. The Black Prince returned home sick. The glory of his youth faded into the gray of pain. He had seen too much: the hunger, the smoke, the endless dying. He died before his father, and his son Richard II took the throne too young to bear its weight. Richard's reign was troubled, torn by rebellion. England, once united, began to split apart within. The same pride that had led it to war now turned inward.
Meanwhile, France began to heal. Under Charles V, the lost lands were reclaimed, fortresses rebuilt, and soldiers hardened once again. The tide was shifting. And then, when both kingdoms seemed too weary to fight again, the war returned. Because war, once awakened, rarely sleeps for long. It was in these years that the nature of battle began to change. The age of knights, those proud riders in shining armor, was ending. The future belonged to the common soldier, the bowman, the man with mud on his boots and a scar on his cheek. And behind him, the first cannons began to roar. Gunpowder, the thunder of a new world. The 100 Years' War was no longer about who had the strongest sword. It was about who could endure the longest. By now, the story was passing to a new generation. A boy king ruled in England, Henry V, bold, cunning, and filled with fire. He would bring the war to France again, one final time, and at a place called Agincourt, carve his name into history. But that is a tale for another night. The fields still rest beneath the stars, and the echoes of Crécy and Poitiers fade into the distance, carried away by the soft wind of memory. The war sleeps, but not for long. The year was 1415. England had a new king, young, sharp, and fierce. Henry V. He had inherited not just a crown, but a dream, an ancient echo of conquest whispered by his ancestors. The war had slept for years, buried under treaties and exhaustion, but Henry awoke it again, with fire in his voice and steel in his hands. He said he had a right to the throne of France, just as Edward III once claimed. He would take what history had denied his forefathers. And across the narrow sea, the ships began to gather once more. In August, Henry sailed from Southampton. The sea was rough, the wind hard, but the king stood firm upon the deck, his eyes fixed on the mist ahead. France. He landed at Harfleur, and the siege began. The walls of Harfleur were thick, old, and stubborn. The defenders fought like lions, and the summer heat turned the trenches into sickness and rot. Henry's men suffered. Dysentery swept through the camp. The stench of disease hung heavy over the earth. Still, the king would not retreat. After long weeks, the city finally yielded. But victory came at a cost. Hundreds dead, thousands too weak to fight. And yet, Henry marched on. He was determined to cross France to Calais, to prove to the world that the English spirit had not faded. But the French army, vast and glittering, waited for him on the road. They outnumbered him 5-1. And so, on a gray October morning, near a village called Agincourt, the armies met. The night before the battle was cold. Rain fell in long, steady sheets, turning the fields to mud. The English soldiers huddled together, soaked and hungry. Some whispered prayers, others sharpened blades that would soon be lost in the mire. Among them, the longbowmen checked their strings, their fingers raw from rein and rope. They had been here before. Crécy, Poitiers, battles where faith and arrows had defeated the impossible. But this felt different. This felt like the edge of the world.
Across the field, the French nobles feasted. Wine, laughter, and confidence filled their tents. They saw the English ranks and smiled. They believed victory was already theirs. Dawn came. A mist hung over the ground, and the mud clung to every boot. The French knights, proud and shining, lined up in thick ranks. Behind wooden stakes, the English archers waited. They planted the stakes in the earth, angled toward the enemy, a forest of death. Then silence. And then the cry. The first English command, carried by the wind. Arrows rose like dark birds and fell with the hiss of rain. The French charged. The earth shook beneath their armor, but the field was narrow, the mud deep. Horses slipped, men stumbled, and the storm of arrows never ceased. One wave after another fell into the mud, crushed beneath their own weight. The English, exhausted but unbroken, stepped forward with swords and mallets, striking down those who could not move. It was slaughter, not battle. By noon, the French pride lay drowned in blood and clay. When the count was made, thousands of French lay dead, dukes, counts, lords, and knights. The English had lost only a few hundred. Agincourt had become a legend. That night, Henry walked the silent field. The moon hung pale above the mist. He saw the faces of the fallen, friend and foe alike. And though history remembers his triumph, the king himself wept. He ordered the dead to be buried with honor. He prayed not for glory, but for peace. Yet peace would not come. Agincourt made Henry a hero. The people of England cheered his name. The crown of France seemed almost within reach. He married the French princess, Catherine of Valois, sealing his victory in silk and ceremony. But fate, as always, had other plans. Henry died young, only 35, before he could enjoy the kingdom he had fought for. His infant son, Henry VI, inherited both crowns, England and France, yet understood neither.
The boy king was gentle, kind, and frail. He loved books and prayer more than battles. While he dreamed of peace, the world around him burned again. France, humiliated but unbroken, found new strength in the voice of a girl, Joan of Arc, a peasant child who heard saints in her sleep. She said God had chosen her to free France, and when she spoke, men listened. Her banner, white with the lilies of France, rose like a flame. At Orleans she broke the siege. The soldiers followed her not out of fear, but out of faith. She gave them what no king could, belief. Her courage turned despair into defiance, and soon the Dauphin, the rightful heir of France, was crowned as Charles VII in Rheims Cathedral, with Joan standing beside him. For the English it was a nightmare, to lose not to armies, but to a vision. They captured her soon after, betrayed by those who feared her power. At Rouen she was tried, not for war, but for her voice. She refused to deny her visions. She refused to repent. And so, at 19, they tied her to a stake and set the fire beneath her feet. Her last word was the name of Jesus. The crowd wept, even as the flames rose. The soldiers turned their faces away, and when it was done, France was never the same again. The war continued, but the tide had turned. The English, once invincible, began to lose city after city. Their armies thinned, their coffers emptied, their spirit cracked. The nobles in England quarreled among themselves. Old alliances broke. The wars at home, the wars of the Roses, began to bloom from the ashes of the 100 Years' War. By 1453, the fighting finally stopped. Calais alone remained in English hands. A century of death brought nothing but exhaustion. France was whole again. England, weary and divided, turned inward.
The long war was over, but the memory of it, the endless marches, the archers in the rain, the burning cities and forgotten graves, lingered like smoke. On quiet nights, in the fields of Normandy and Picardy, the wind still seems to carry the sound of hooves and arrows, the voices of men who never came home, the whispers of kings who dreamed of crowns too heavy for any head to bear. The war that lasted 100 years, a war that began for pride and ended because there was nothing left to fight for.
The rain had stopped. The smoke had faded. But the silence that followed the 100 Years' War was not peace. It was emptiness. The land itself seemed tired. Fields that had burned for generations lay wild again. Castles crumbled quietly into the earth, their banners long forgotten. The people walked through the ruins with a strange kind of stillness, the stillness of those who had survived too much. France had won, but what did victory mean after 100 years of loss? The cities were broken, the farmlands scarred. The nobles who had ruled with pride were dead or diminished. A new power was rising, not of knights and kings, but of nations. And in England, across the Channel, another storm was brewing. The war abroad had ended, but a war at home was waiting. The Wars of the Roses, brothers fighting brothers for the same crown their fathers had carried into France. It seemed that the ghosts of Crécy and Agincourt still whispered to the living, urging them to keep fighting, even when there was nothing left to gain. For 100 years, men had lived by the sword, but now the sword was changing. The longbow, once feared, was fading into memory. Gunpowder had taken its place, the thunder of cannons, the smoke of muskets. The world was moving on. The old code of chivalry, of honor, loyalty, single combat, had withered in the mud of battlefields. No longer did knights ride forth to meet in fair combat. Now the victor was not the bravest man, but the one who could fire first. The age of heroes was ending. The age of nations had begun. Yet some things never fade. The stories remained, of kings and captives, of arrows that fell like rain, of a girl who burned for her belief. They became songs whispered by travelers at taverns, told beside hearths in winter. The peasants spoke of the Black Prince, of Henry's victory, of Joan's courage. Each tale changed in the telling. Some said she rode on clouds, others that her spirit still guarded the French fields. History softened into legend, and legend, in time, became memory. And memory never truly dies. If you walk, even now, through the countryside of Normandy or Gascony, you might find the faint outline of an old trench, a stone where once a standard was raised, a hollow where horses fell. The earth remembers. It keeps the secrets men try to forget.
The poppies grow where blood once soaked the soil. The streams still run red in the stories of the people. And in the stillness of night, when the fog drifts low, you might hear what sounds like the rustle of armor, or the cry of an archer calling to his brothers. Echoes of a century that refused to end. The war had begun with a question:
Who should wear a crown? And it ended with another. Was any crown worth the cost? 100 years of marching, dying, burning, rebuilding. And yet, in the ashes, something new had been born. France had become a single kingdom, united under its own king, not divided by feudal lords. England had become an island kingdom, turning its gaze inward, away from conquest, toward itself. Both nations had found their identity in struggle. And so, the war that tore them apart also made them who they were. Time drifted onward. The bells of Paris rang again. In London, the Thames flowed quietly past rebuilt docks and towers. New kings sat upon thrones, new dreams replaced old wounds. But the past never vanished. It waited in the pages of chroniclers, in the lines of songs, in the long, unending sigh of history. The war that lasted 100 years had become something greater than itself, a mirror for all wars that followed, a warning written in blood and rain. And now, as you close your eyes and listen to the silence left behind, imagine the wind across the fields of Crécy, the faint tolling of distant bells, the footsteps of soldiers long gone. Their story is done. Their battle is over, but their voices still drift through time, soft as sleep, endless as memory. The war that lasted 100 years, England versus France in eternal battle. A war that outlived kings, a war that shaped the world, a war that, in its silence, still speaks. The century was over, but the echoes did not fade. In the monasteries, monks bent over parchment by candlelight, writing the chronicles of kings and battles, of Crécy and Poitiers, of Henry and Joan. Their quills scratched softly across the vellum, preserving the memories of men who had once believed they were eternal. Outside, the world moved on. Children were born in villages rebuilt from ash. Traders opened stalls in the markets again. The smell of bread replaced the scent of smoke. But beneath it all, the war lived quietly in the soil. 100 years of blood cannot be washed away so easily. In England, the kings who had once dreamed of ruling France found themselves at war with their own families. The roses of red and white bloomed not in gardens, but on battlefields. The Wars of the Roses, a final echo of the century-long conflict that had consumed their fathers and grandfathers. The men who once cheered victory now wondered what it had all meant. For even those who wore crowns found that peace was not the same as happiness. A throne gained through endless war was a lonely seat. In France, Joan of Arc became more than a saint. She became a symbol. Farmers spoke her name as they sowed their fields. Mothers whispered her courage to their daughters. And the French kings, once divided by pride and ambition, now ruled a land that believed again in itself. France had suffered, yes, but it had endured. And endurance, not victory, was the true triumph of that long, cruel century. The 100 Years' War had begun as a quarrel of kings, but it ended as a war of peoples. England and France were no longer just crowns and castles. They were nations, breathing, living,
remembering. The knights who once charged in gleaming armor were gone. Their world, of honor and banners, of duels and faith, had passed into myth. Gunpowder had rewritten the rules, and with it, the age of modern war had begun. The world had changed forever. But history is not only written by kings or chroniclers. It is written in whispers, in the quiet stories of those who lived and died unseen. The blacksmith who forged swords by night, knowing his sons might fall by them. The widow who lit a candle each evening, waiting for a husband who would never return. The archer who still dreamed of the sky darkened by his own arrows. The peasant girl who saw a saint in her sleep and believed her dream could save a country. Their names are lost, but their shadows remain. The 100 Years' War was not one story. It was thousands, intertwined like roots beneath the earth. Each battle a heartbeat, each loss a breath, each hope a flicker against the dark. And as centuries passed, their stories became history, and history became legend. The line between what was real and what was remembered blurred like mist over the fields of Normandy. Perhaps that is why, even now, the war feels unfinished, as though somewhere beyond the veil of time, the banners still flutter and the drums still sound in the distance. Close your eyes for a moment. Listen. The rain begins to fall again, softly, over an empty battlefield. The horses are gone. The cries have faded. Only the wind moves now, whispering through the grass. It carries with it the voices of 100 years, kings and soldiers, dreamers and martyrs, all bound by one unending truth, that glory fades, but memory endures. And so the story ends, not with victory, not with defeat, but with silence. A silence so deep it becomes eternal. A silence where the past rests and the world finally breathes again. The war that lasted 100 years. A war of crowns, of faith, of destiny. A war that shaped England and France, and through them shaped the world itself. But history, like the tide, always returns. For as long as men desire power, as long as kingdoms dream of glory, the echoes of that war will stir again, in every flag raised, in every march begun.
The 100 Years' War was not the end. It was a beginning of nations, of modern war, of the endless struggle between pride and peace. Now the world sleeps, and in the stillness of that sleep, the war's long echo hums faintly beneath the earth, a lullaby of armor and fire, a memory of men who once believed they could rule forever. The story of England and France, of kings and crowns, of loss and endurance, drifts now into the quiet, where time itself forgets to move. And you, the listener, carry that silence with you, the last breath of a century, the final whisper of a war that never truly ended. Sleep now, for the war is done. The banners are lowered, the swords are still,
Only the wind remains. Only the memory endures. The centuries after the war were quiet, but they were never empty. In the silence that followed, new stories began to bloom, not in the halls of kings, but in the hearts of those who remembered what the war had taken. In a small village in Normandy, a blacksmith's hammer struck the anvil once more. Each clang echoed through the valley like a heartbeat reborn. His father had fallen at Crécy. His grandfather had died before Poitiers. He himself had never held a sword, yet his hands still trembled when he shaped the steel. Every spark felt like a ghost of the past, a reminder that war leaves behind more than scars. It leaves echoes. He did not speak of the war, but sometimes, when the nights were long and the fire burned low, he swore he could still hear the marching, the soft, distant rhythm of boots on soil, the song of men who never came home. Far to the west, in England's rolling countryside, an old woman sat by her window, weaving. Her eyes were tired, but her fingers moved with memory. She wove patterns of blue and gold, of lions and lilies, the symbols of England and France intertwined. She had been a child when the archers returned from Agincourt, their eyes hollow, their hands calloused.
They had spoken not of glory, but of mud and rain, and the sound of the wounded crying for God. So she wove their pain into her cloth, thread by thread, turning sorrow into beauty. When she died, her tapestry hung in a chapel, and no one remembered her name, but her work survived, and in its threads the story still lived. In the city of Orleans, people still spoke of a girl, a shepherdess who had heard the voice of heaven. Her name was whispered like a prayer, softly, reverently, as if the air itself carried her spirit. Every year they lit candles in her honor. Children carried white lilies through the streets, and though the years turned to centuries, her fire never dimmed. Joan of Arc, the girl who had believed, the girl who had burned, and in burning had lit a nation's heart. Even kings who once doubted her now bowed their heads when her name was spoken. She had become something greater than the war itself, a symbol that faith could rise from fire and hope could survive even in the darkest of times. In an abbey's quiet garden, a monk tended to roses beside the gravestones of long-dead knights. He hummed softly to himself, a song he barely remembered, a tune that might once have been sung by soldiers before battle. He did not know their names. He did not need to. He knew that each blade of grass that grew above them was their peace, a peace they had never found in life. Sometimes, when the wind passed through the cloister, it seemed to whisper words he could not understand, ancient names, lost vows, the sighs of history itself. He smiled. He believed they were finally at rest. And yet, the world moved on. The castles that had once stood proud now wore ivy like crowns. The fields that had once run red now grew gold with harvest. Children played where kings had fallen. The past became soft, like the fading of a dream before dawn. But dreams never vanish. They only change shape. The 100 Years' War had ended, but its spirit lived on in every border drawn,
in every king who looked beyond his kingdom's edge and wondered if he might take more.
History remembers its wars, but it rarely remembers its peace. In time, the poets came. They wrote of the brave, the doomed, the divine. They turned battles into verses, pain into rhythm, and sorrow into something almost beautiful. They spoke of knights riding through twilight fields, of banners shining in the rain, of kings who wept for what they had lost, not thrones, but sons and dreams and the quiet of their own hearts. They wrote so the dead would not be forgotten, and perhaps, in doing so, they gave them a kind of immortality. And now, you too have heard their story, not as kings told it, but as time remembers it. Faint, gentle, like the last light of a candle before sleep. Close your eyes. Breathe. The war is long past. The voices are quiet now. But if you listen, in that soft space between waking and dreaming, you might still hear them. The song of the bowstrings, the prayer of the soldiers, the whisper of a crown falling to the ground. They are gone, but they are not forgotten. The war that lasted 100 years, England versus France, in eternal battle. A story of kings and commoners, of faith and fire, of war that became legend. And legend, in time, became a lullaby. Sleep now, for the war has finally ended. The centuries rest, the memories fade, and peace, soft, eternal peace, has come at last.
Long after the last sword was sheathed, after the fires went out and the banners fell, the echoes of that war still lingered, in the corridors of power, in the pulse of nations, in the unspoken dreams of kings yet to come. The world had changed, but it had not forgotten. England, once the proud invader, turned its gaze inward. No longer could its kings claim a crown across the sea. Instead, they sought a crown at home, a unity that would come only through struggle and time. From the ashes of the 100 Years' War rose the Tudor dynasty, a family forged in blood, bound by the lessons of a century of conflict. Henry VII built peace from ruin. He understood what endless war had cost, how power without purpose left only emptiness. And under his son, Henry VIII, England's gaze shifted once more, not to France, but toward the vast oceans. The age of conquest was not over. It had merely changed its map. Across the Channel, France stood tall, scarred but whole. No longer a patchwork of feudal lords in rival crowns, it had become a single nation, its people bound by shared pain, its heart beating to one rhythm. From the flames of war rose a new France, a France of kings who ruled not by right of conquest, but by the will of the people's endurance. Charles VII, who had reclaimed his crown, rebuilt his kingdom from ruin.
The stones of broken castles became the foundations of new cities. The blood that once soaked the soil became the roots of unity. And above it all, the memory of Joan remained, the light that refused to fade, a reminder that courage could outlast empires. The 100 Years' War had ended, but its lessons spread far beyond its borders. It taught the world that power was fragile, that crowns could fall as quickly as they rose. It taught that the will of the people, once awakened, could not be silenced. And it showed that war, no matter how righteous it begins, always ends in the same silence, the silence of loss. In time, both England and France reached across the seas, to Africa, to Asia, to the New World. They carried with them not only ambition, but the memory of rivalry. Each sought to outshine the other, in trade, in empire, in pride.
The shadow of that old war followed them, like a ghost they could never outrun. Even when they no longer fought for the same throne, they still measured themselves against one another, in ships, in colonies, in history itself. Their destinies had become intertwined forever. And so the echo of the 100 Years' War stretched onward, not just through centuries, but through the very soul of Europe. It shaped borders and languages, faith and art, kings and revolutions. It taught the world that nations are born not in peace, but in the long, painful rhythm of conflict and reconciliation. Every flag raised, every oath sworn, every dream of unity or power carried within it a faint whisper of that long war. Even now, when the bells of London ring and the Seine flows beneath the bridges of Paris, their echoes touch, softly, unseen, like the ghosts of old enemies nodding to one another across time. England and France, two nations that once sought to destroy each other and instead taught each other what it means to endure. Centuries passed, empires rose and fell, but the roots of modern Europe, its pride, its rivalry, its unity, still trace back to that long, unending war. It was never truly about one crown. It was about what it means to belong, to a land, to a people, to an idea that outlives kings. And so, even now, when the rain falls softly on the fields of Crécy or Agincourt, you can still feel it, the pulse of that history, slow and steady, like the heartbeat of the world remembering itself. The 100 Years' War is long over, but its echoes never died. They live in every anthem, in every rivalry of sport or pride, in every tale of courage and defeat that we still tell. Because history is not only what happened, it is what we remember and what we choose never to forget. Sleep now, traveler. Let the voices of the past fade softly into the dark. Let the echoes of power, of kings and crowns, of love and loss, settle into silence. For the war that lasted 100 years still whispers, not of conquest, but of memory. and memory never truly ends. The centuries have faded, the kings have turned to dust, and yet the story still lingers, like a candle that refuses to go out, its light trembling softly against the wind of time. History does not end, it sleeps. And sometimes, when the world is quiet enough, it dreams. The 100 Years' War was not only about land or crowns or pride. It was about something older, something deeper. The endless rhythm of human ambition. The hunger to rule, the longing to belong, the hope to be remembered. Every arrow loosed, every sword drawn, was born not from hatred alone, but from the belief that glory could outlast life.
And yet, in the end, it is never the victors we remember most. It is the dreamers, the ones who believed, even as the fires burned, that peace was possible. There is a strange mercy in time. It erases wounds, but keeps the lessons. It buries names, but lets the meaning rise like smoke. So what did the 100 Years' War teach the world? That war is never truly won. That pride, once unleashed, devours its master. That faith, whether in God or king or country, can both save and destroy. And that hope, though fragile, is the one thing that endures when everything else is gone. In the quiet after the war, Europe began to wake. Nations were born. Ideas stirred. Men began to write not only of God and kings, but of people, of themselves. The Renaissance bloomed from the ashes of medieval war. Pain gave birth to art, and death to understanding. It was as if, after a century of darkness, the world opened its eyes again. And what did it see? That beauty survives, that love outlasts conquest, that peace, no matter how fragile, is always worth seeking. In the end, the 100 Years' War was not a single story, but a mirror. It showed humanity what it was capable of, the heights of courage and the depths of cruelty. It revealed that even in chaos there is a rhythm, a heartbeat that keeps the world moving forward. Every age has its war. Every generation faces its struggle. But history whispers, softly, that nothing, not crowns, not power, not pain, lasts forever. Only memory does. Only the stories remain. And so we tell them, again and again, across centuries, across languages, so that the dead may sleep in peace and the living may understand. Because in remembering, we keep them alive, not the kings, not the conquerors, but the people. The farmers who rebuilt the earth, the widows who lit candles in the dark, the dreamers who saw a better world. They are the true victors, the quiet architects of the peace that followed. Close your eyes. Hear the wind. It carries the same sound it did 600 years ago. Soft, endless, patient.
It whispers through the grass, through the ruins, through time itself. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the faint echo of those long-ago voices, the soldiers, the kings, the saints, and beneath them, the one voice that has never faded, the voice of humanity, tired, hopeful, and still dreaming. The 100 Years' War is over, but its lesson remains, that every empire falls, every crown fades, and every heart, in the end, seeks only peace. So let it rest now. Let the past lie gently beneath the soil. Let the ghosts of kings sleep beneath their broken towers. The world has turned. The centuries have passed. And the wars that followed were all, in some small way, echoes of this one. But even echoes grow softer, and one day, even memory becomes silence. And in that silence, perhaps, we find what all the wars were meant to find, the stillness of understanding, that there is nothing greater to conquer than the restless heart of man himself. Sleep now. Let the story fade. The war has ended. The lesson remains. For in the quiet after the battle, when the world breathes again, peace does not shout, it whispers. And tonight, it whispers to you. The world is quiet now. The banners have turned to dust, the crowns to memory, and the echoes of battle have faded into the gentle hum of time. Night has fallen over the fields of France, over the cliffs of England, over the rivers and ruins that once trembled with the footsteps of armies. The war that raged for a century is gone, but its breath still lingers in the soil. Its story still drifts in the air. And as the moon rises, casting her silver light over the sleeping land, the world exhales. At last, there is peace. Somewhere, deep in the countryside, an ancient oak stands alone. It has seen it all, the march of soldiers, the cries of horses, the smoke that once darkened the sky. Its roots twist through the earth, touching layers of forgotten bones, and yet it lives, tall, patient, eternal. The wind sighs through its branches like the voices of those who came before. They do not speak of war anymore. They speak of rest, of the sun on their faces, of laughter, of the simple, unremembered peace that followed. In the villages, life has returned. Children play where once the armies marched. Their laughter rings like church bells in the morning light. A mother kneels by a stream, washing linen in the same waters that once ran red. She hums a tune passed down through generations, a song that has forgotten its sorrow. The world rebuilds itself quietly, without the need for kings or crowns, only the rhythm of time, gentle and endless. Far away, in a monastery by the sea, an old monk writes by candlelight. His ink is almost gone,
His hands shake as he writes the final words, and so it ended. He pauses, watching the flame flicker. Then he smiles, because he knows that stories never truly end. They only sleep, waiting to be told again. He closes the book, places it gently upon the shelf, and lets the candle burn down to nothing. Outside, the tide rolls in, washing over the stones that have stood since the first day of the war. The waves whisper softly against the shore, as if the sea itself remembers. Time moves on. The kings become myths, their faces fading from coins and carvings, but the lessons remain, woven into the fabric of every age that followed. The idea of nation, the dream of peace, the cost of pride, and, above all, the quiet truth that every empire, no matter how vast, must one day kneel before time. Now, the fields that once burned are calm again. The stars return to their silent watch, and across the Channel, the two lands, England and France, sleep side by side beneath the same night sky. They no longer fight. They no longer dream of conquest. They simply are, bound not by war, but by history, by memory, by time.
If you listen now, in the soft hum of night, in the rustle of the wind through the grass, in the far-off murmur of the sea, you can still hear it. The heartbeat of history, slow, gentle, endless. It is the pulse of a world that remembers and forgives. The 100 Years' War has closed its eyes. The story has settled into silence, but the silence is not empty. It is full of what was and what will never be again. It is the silence of peace earned through pain, of history resting at last. And now, dear listener, let the story rest. Let your thoughts drift like leaves carried down a quiet river. The kings are gone, the wars are over. Only the wind remains, soft and eternal. Listen to it. It is the same wind that touched their faces, the same wind that carries their memory into the night. And if you close your eyes, you will feel it too, the breath of the world, the sleep of history. Sleep well, for the war is done, the world remembers, and the night forgives. The war that lasted 100 years has finally found its peace.
The sailors hum softly as they work, their songs not of conquest, but of homecoming. And in France, a market opens its wooden gates. The sound of chatter and coin replaces the drumbeat of battle. For the first time in a century, the world feels young again. The scars remain, in the stone walls, in the burned edges of forgotten letters, in the eyes of those who remember. But the scars are not wounds anymore. They are stories. They are proof that life endured. The land, though battered, is alive. The rivers still flow. The stars still rise. And the people, those fragile, stubborn souls, they rebuild. Centuries later, historians will call it the 100 Years' War. They will speak of Edward and Henry, of Joan and Charles, of sieges and treaties, crowns and claims. But the truth, the quiet truth, is that behind the noise of history was the soft heartbeat of those who simply wanted to live. The farmers, the mothers, the children who never chose sides. They were the true victors of this endless war. Because they endured, they dreamed, they rebuilt the world from ashes. Now the sun climbs higher, the mist fades, the world glows with gold, and the story, the long, weary, beautiful story, comes to its end, not with the cry of battle, but with the whisper of peace. The banners of England and France no longer face each other as enemies, but as neighbors beneath the same light. The centuries of rivalry have given way to something stronger, understanding. History, for all its pain, is just the long road that leads us here, to morning. And so, the war that lasted 100 years ends not with victory, but with awakening. The earth turns quietly, the world breathes again, and time carries forward, gentle as the tide. Sleep now, listener. Let the story rest within you. Let the centuries drift away, leaving only the calm that follows the storm.
The kings have vanished into memory. The sailors hum softly as they work, their songs not of conquest, but of homecoming. And in France, a market opens its wooden gates. The sound of chatter and coin replaces the drumbeat of battle. For the first time in a century, the world feels young again. The scars remain, in the stone walls, in the burned edges of forgotten letters, in the eyes of those who remember. But the scars are not wounds anymore. They are stories. They are proof that life endured. The land, though battered, is alive. The rivers still flow. The stars still rise. And the people, those fragile, stubborn souls, they rebuild. Centuries later, historians will call it the 100 Years' War. They will speak of Edward and Henry, of Joan and Charles, of sieges and treaties, crowns and claims. But the truth, the quiet truth, is that behind the noise of history was the soft heartbeat of those who simply wanted to live. The farmers, the mothers, the children who never chose sides. They were the true victors of this endless war. Because they endured, They dreamed. They rebuilt the world from ashes. Now the sun climbs higher. The mist fades. The world glows with gold. And the story, the long, weary, beautiful story, comes to an end. Not with the cry of battle, but with the whisper of peace. The banners of England and France no longer face each other as enemies, but as neighbors beneath the same light. The centuries of rivalry have given way to something stronger: understanding.
History, for all its pain, is just the long road that leads us here to morning. And so the war that lasted 100 years ends not with victory, but with awakening. The earth turns quietly, the world breathes again, and time carries forward gentle as the tide. Sleep now, listener. Let the story rest within you. Let the centuries drift away, leaving only the calm that follows the storm. Swords are rust, but peace endures. And in this stillness, as the dawn breaks over the old battlefields, the world begins again. The war that lasted 100 years, England versus France in eternal battle, has ended. But history is only ever sleeping. Until someone dreams it once more. And yet, as the world turns and centuries slip quietly past, the echo of that long war never truly fades. It lingers, soft and ancient, woven into the tapestry of time. The land remembers. The rivers still whisper their secrets to the sea, and the stones of old castles hum faintly beneath the moss. The ghosts of kings and knights do not haunt with sorrow any more. They drift like mist at dawn, peaceful, content to be remembered. In the heart of France, where once the banners of England flew, a traveler pauses by a ruined tower. Its walls crumble, its shadow long. He places his hand upon the cold stone, and for a moment he feels something.
Not pain, not pride, but presence. As though the air itself carries the breath of those who fought and fell. The tower does not speak, but it remembers. It holds the weight of time, of men and dreams and endless skies. Across the channel, on English soil, a young historian opens a book. Its pages are yellowed, its ink faded. She reads the words slowly, the names, the dates, the sorrow behind the lines. Her candle flickers as she turns the page, and the faint scent of old parchment fills the air.
It smells like memory, like the echo of fire and rain. She closes the book, presses her palm against the cover, and whispers quietly, "We remember." The war that once divided has become a bridge. Through trade, through culture, through centuries of peace hard won and often tested, England and France grew not apart, but together. They share art, language, and laughter. They share loss. They share the same sky, and beneath it, the same story, told 1,000 times in 1,000 ways. What began as conquest ended as kinship. Time, patient and merciful, turned enemies into echoes, and echoes into understanding. And somewhere, deep beneath that same sky, the spirit of history breathes. It has no face, no voice, no throne, but it watches and it waits. It knows that humanity will always rise and fall, build and break, fight and forgive. It is not the wars that define us, but what we become when the wars are done. Now, as twilight falls again on the quiet countryside, a breeze stirs the tall grass. It moves softly, as though brushing against the ghosts of the past. The air hums with the faintest song, a lullaby for the dead, a hymn for the living.
The stars appear, one by one. The moon rises, the earth turns, and the story, our story, goes on. So close your eyes. Let the sound of the wind carry you. Let the centuries drift by like clouds, because though the battles have long ended, the lessons still whisper in the dark. That pride is fleeting, but compassion endures. That power fades, but peace remembers. That even after 100 years of war, the dawn always comes. Always. The story is ending now. The world grows quiet once more. The fire that burned through centuries dims, leaving only soft embers glowing in the dark. Listen closely. You can still hear the faint rhythm of it. Not the clash of steel, not the cry of kings, but something gentler. A heartbeat. Steady. Eternal. The heartbeat of history.
You have lowered the sounds of your name. My name is King of the Kings, Gimbal Himagum, the battle whistles. There is blood in the sun, there is blood in the night, there is blood in the very waters we drink. Tonight we will not.
And someone listens. Maybe you. Eyes heavy, breath calm, heart still. The story seeps into your dreams, not as a lesson, but as a presence, a reminder that history is not distant. It lives in the quiet corners of every life. The kings are gone, the crowns are dust, but their echoes move through time, turning into thoughts, into questions, into wisdom whispered softly by the years. Time does not erase, it transforms. And what once was war becomes story. What once was blood becomes meaning. And so the war that lasted 100 years finds its final rest here, in the hush between heartbeats, in the silence before dawn, in the voice that tells it once more and then lets it go. The story is complete, the circle closes, the world exhales. Now the stars shimmer over old battlefields. No armies march there now. Only the wind moves, soft and forgiving. It carries the laughter of children, the whisper of rivers, the sigh of peace that followed pain. The past does not vanish. It becomes light, and that light still falls upon us. So as you drift into sleep, know this: the war is over, the story is told, and time keeps its promise. To heal, to remember, to begin again. The war that lasted 100 years, England versus France in eternal battle, has ended not in victory, but in peace. And as the final echoes fade, only one sound remains: the soft breath of the earth, the murmur of history resting. Close your eyes. Let it go. And someone listens. Maybe you. Eyes heavy, breath calm, heart still. The story seeps into your dreams, not as a lesson, but as a presence, a reminder that history is not distant. It lives in the quiet corners of every life. The kings are gone, the crowns are dust, but their echoes move through time, turning into thoughts, into questions, into wisdom whispered softly by the years. Time does not erase, it transforms. And what once was war becomes story. What once was blood becomes meaning. And so the war that lasted 100 years finds its final rest here, in the hush between heartbeats, in the silence before dawn, in the voice that tells it once more